They weren't just machines, they were monsters of wood, fire, and steel built to tear down cities and rewrite the battlefield. For today's video, I'm gonna count down 15 of the most epic ancient siege weapons. Let's start with number 15, the giant siege tower of Rhodes, the Heliopolis. In the 3rd century BCE, the city of Rhodes faced a siege unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. The attacker, Demetrius I of Macedon, the besieger of cities, his weapon of choice was not a battering ram or a catapult, but a monstrous siege engine that towered over anything built before or since. It was called the Heliopolis, which means taker of cities in Greek, and it stood over 130 feet tall and weighed an estimated 160 tons. This titanic war machine was so massive and so complex, it had been described as the ancient world's equivalent of a mobile skyscraper. The Heliopolis was constructed during the Siege of Rhodes in 305 BCE, one of the most ambitious but ultimately unsuccessful assaults in the annals of classic warfare. According to ancient sources, it was constructed on a base that measured about 45 square feet. It was divided into 9 stories, each with its own arsenal of projectile weapons. The lowest levels housed battering rams designed to punch through city walls, while the upper tiers were fitted with catapults, ballistae, and scorpions that could fire heavy bolts. The entire structure was mounted on 8 huge wheels, each reportedly over 12 feet in diameter, with iron-plated exteriors to protect them from fire and sabotage. This mobility was made possible by a team of over 3,000 men who used pulleys, ropes, and brute force to roll this thing forward. Inside, hundreds of slingers and archers could fire from behind protected shutters, while engineers operated the torsion-powered weapons mounted on each level. The goal of this thing was clear: bombard the defenders, breach the walls, and roll forward with the unstoppable momentum of a moving fortress. But despite its engineering brilliance, the Heliopolis failed in its ultimate mission. The Rhodians, though vastly outnumbered, mounted a clever and spirited defense. They diverted attacks, reinforced weak points, and most importantly, they undermined the Heliopolis by digging trenches and using fire to stall its movement. During a storm, heavy rains caused part of the ground beneath it to soften, and the mighty tower began to sink and tip. The Heliopolis may not have won its war, but it does remain a marvel of ancient siegecraft. It pushed the limits of logistics, engineering, and battlefield psychology. It was the ultimate ancient superweapon, part machine, part monument, and entirely terrifying. Number 14, the Roman Corvus, the boarding bridge that turned the sea into a battlefield. In the 3rd century BCE, as Rome and Carthage clashed in the First Punic War, the Romans found themselves in unfamiliar territory: naval warfare. Carthage was a maritime superpower with centuries of seafaring experience and a fleet of maneuverable warships. Rome, by contrast, was a land power, more accustomed to infantry battle than naval warfare. But the Romans were nothing if not adaptive, and their secret weapon in leveling the naval playing field was a massive boarding device called the corvus, Latin for crow or raven, that allowed them to transform naval battles into land battles at sea. The corvus was a pivoting gangplank, approximately 36 feet long and 4 feet wide, mounted on the prow of Roman warships with multiple banks of oars. At the tip of the corvus was a metal spike or hook shaped like a bird's beak, designed to slam into the enemy decks and bite down, creating an instant bridge between the vessels. The device's introduction was a direct result of desperation. During the early phases of the First Punic War, that was about 264 to 240 BCE, Rome had lost several naval engagements due to inexperience and inferior seamanship. Carthaginian sailors could outmaneuver them with ease, and the Romans realized they couldn't win by outsailing the Carthaginians, so they changed the rules. The corvus allowed the Romans to eliminate Carthage's mobility advantage, bringing the fight into their comfort zone. Roman soldiers could now do what they did best: fight hand to hand, shield to shield, and sword to sword. It was also an ingenious psychological blow as well. No Carthaginian captain wanted to see a corvus swinging into position because it meant that they were about to be invaded, not by pirates, but by a full cohort of disciplined killers in armor. But the Corvus did have its flaws. It was top-heavy and added a significant weight to the bow of the ship, making Roman warships less stable in rough seas. This drawback may have contributed to several catastrophic Roman naval losses later in the war, when fleets were destroyed in storms. Yet its impact had already been made. The Corvus wasn't just a boarding bridge, it was a shift. It demonstrated that Rome's refusal to lose on unfamiliar terms, rather than adapt to sea warfare as it was, Rome forced the sea to become land, and used their superior discipline and tactics to gain control over the Mediterranean. Number 13. The Roman siege hooks. When Roman legions laid siege to a city, they didn't just surround it and wait. They brought an arsenal of machines designed to rip, tear, burn, batter, and climb. And among their most brutal tools was a device that sounded more like something from a monster movie than a military manual. The siege hook. Iron claws mounted on poles, cranes, or battering machines used to physically rip stones from enemy walls, leaving them exposed to collapse, scaling, or assault. While battering rams and ballistae get the headlines, siege hooks were the silent killers of ancient sieges. These were giant curved iron implements, often with serrated or spiked ends, attached to the ends of wooden booms or vertical cranes. The device would be lifted up by pulleys or capstans, sometimes mounted on mobile platforms, and then driven into the seams between the stone blocks in a wall. Once lodged, soldiers would pull the hook backwards with ropes or levers, attempting to pry stones loose. The visual impact was stunning. Imagine watching from your battlements as a Roman machine extended a massive hooked claw toward your parapet, locked onto part of your wall, and just yanked. Stones would shudder, mortar would crack, whole sections might loosen or collapse. What made the siege hook terrifying was its surgical nature. While rams attacked broadly and catapults indiscriminately smashed at height, the hook targeted specific weaknesses: collapsed sections, improperly jointed stones, or corners with poor reinforcement. It was a psychological weapon too. Defenders never knew where the next piece of wall might vanish. And these weapons weren't a standalone thing. Siege hooks were often part of larger machines attached to siege cranes, or in some cases they were mounted on articulated arms controlled by engineers from behind cover. And they weren't only used on stone. Siege hooks could drag down wooden palisades, remove protective screens, or yank away parts of enemy siege defenses. If something could be pulled or pried, the hook would do the job. Few ancient weapons embody the Roman mindset better: precise, efficient, destructive, and terrifying to behold. A clawed hand reaching out from a war machine to rip your defenses apart stone by stone, like the grasp of the empire itself. Number 12. The Byzantine Greek fire siphons, flamethrowers of the ancient world. Among the most terrifying weapons ever unleashed in ancient siege warfare, few can compare to the sheer psychological and physical devastation of Greek fire. A combustible liquid that could be launched over walls, onto ships, and into crowds with terrifying effect, even burning on water. And though the substance itself is legendary, what made it a true instrument of siege was the method of delivery: pressurized bronze siphons mounted on walls or ships and used by Byzantine engineers to spray liquid fire at besieging enemies. Most historians believe it contained a mixture of petroleum, quicklime, sulfur, and other incendiary chemicals, creating a sticky, viscous fuel that would ignite on contact with air or water and cling to surfaces like modern napalm. But the genius of this weapon wasn't just in the fuel, it was the siphons used to deliver it. These siphons consisted of bronze pressure chambers, sealed containers that built up gas or steam pressure to eject Greek fire through narrow nozzles. Inside the chamber, a system of bellows or mechanical plungers was used to force the substance out at velocity. The result? A jet of flame that could be aimed and controlled with terrifying accuracy. In land-based sieges, Greek fire siphons were mounted atop towers and on ramparts. Byzantine soldiers would stand behind iron or stone shields, load the pressurized tanks with fresh fuel, and open the valve. Some versions were handheld, resembling large fire hoses or flamethrower cannons, allowing greater mobility, and others were mounted on chariots or carts, used for counter-assaults and breaking enemy formations with literal firepower. Over time, though, Greek fire did fade from use, not because it stopped being effective, but because the exact knowledge of its composition and the mechanics of its siphons were lost, possibly deliberately, during the collapse of the Byzantine power. By the time the Ottomans besieged Constantinople in 1453, the weapon had disappeared from the battlefield, but its legend remained, and with it, the image of bronze dragons belching fire over walls. The Greek fire siphons were not just weapons, they were a psychological force multiplier. They remind us that the ancients were not just builders and thinkers, but engineers of horror, crafting machines that could melt courage as easily as they melted timber. Number 11. The Assyrian siege ramps. In the long and brutal history of ancient siegecraft, few tactics were more devastatingly effective or more physically massive than the use of siege ramps. And among the most famous examples in history is the Siege of Lachish, where the Assyrian army under King Sennacherib constructed a colossal ramp of dirt and stone to overwhelm the heavily fortified city walls of a stronghold in 701 BCE. The Assyrians were master siege engineers, perhaps the most advanced of the ancient Near East. They didn't merely batter walls with rams or hurl stones with slings, they reshaped the landscape itself, raising entire platforms of earth to breach high walls and storm cities on level footing. Lachish, located southwest of Jerusalem, was the second most important city in the Kingdom of Judah at the time. It featured massive double walls, steep outer slopes, and heavily defended gates. But the Assyrians didn't bother with ladders or direct attacks. Instead, they began building a ramp that will allow them to roll battering rams, siege towers, and entire infantry divisions up to the base of the wall. The process of doing this was monumental. Using thousands of laborers, slaves, and soldiers, the Assyrians moved tons of rock, soil, and debris, piling it against the city's outer defenses. It was slow, methodical, and unstoppable. The ramp eventually rose to a height of nearly 25 meters, spanning an estimated 100 meters in length. And this wasn't just engineering, it was psychological. The defenders here would have watched day by day as their position was erased by Assyrian labor. And all the while, archers provided cover, slingers targeted watchtowers, and engineers cleared obstacles in front of the advancing mountain. Once the ramp reached the proper height, the Assyrians unleashed their final blow: siege engines, likely massive wheeled battering rams protected by iron-plated roofs and driven by elite troops. They pounded the defenses mercilessly while soldiers climbed behind them, storming the city in brutal waves. The result was total destruction. What makes these siege ramps of Lachish so extraordinary is the scale, its efficiency, and its raw statement of power. The Assyrians didn't need tricks, magic, or divine intervention. They used earth and time. They buried the defenses of Lachish within the world itself, and then they just walked right in. Number 10. The Tortoise, the Roman siege shelter. Of all the Roman innovations with siege warfare, few were more deceptively simple or universally effective than the testudo, or tortoise, a mobile shelter used to protect troops and equipment as they advanced. While often confused with the infantry formation, where soldiers locked shields over their heads, the siege tortoise was a physical structure, a wheeled, roofed shelter covered in iron or wet hides used to shield engineers, sappers, and rams. Inside the tortoise, Roman engineers and legionaries worked tirelessly. Some rammed at the walls, others dug trenches beneath the enemy fortifications to collapse them, a technique known as undermining. Still others cleared debris, filled moats, or laid fire at wooden palisades. In all cases, the tortoise protected them from arrows, rocks, oil, and boiling pitch raining down from above. One of the most famous uses of the tortoise happened during Julius Caesar's siege of Avaricum in Gaul, 52 BCE. The city, built on a hill and protected by rivers, was considered nearly impregnable. Caesar's engineers built a long earthen ramp to bring siege towers within range. But while the ramp was under construction, the tortoise protected the workers. These massive tortoises allowed troops to labor under constant enemy fire, safe from flaming arrows and falling stones. But the tortoise wasn't only about defense, it was part of Rome's offensive ethos. Roman military doctrine emphasized relentless pressure. Break the gate, undermine the wall, light the base, overwhelm the tower. The tortoise let them do all that while minimizing risk to their most skilled personnel. Over time, more elaborate siege shelters evolved with rotating wheels, segmented armor, and even collapsible roofs. But the basic Roman tortoise remained a staple of siege warfare for centuries, influencing medieval mantlets and even modern armored personnel carrier concepts. It wasn't the most dramatic siege engine ever built, but it was one of the most useful and one of the most enduring. Like the empire that built it, the tortoise didn't dazzle, it just conquered. Number 9. The onager, Rome's recoiling siege machine. The Romans, always masters of refinement over invention, didn't invent the torsion-powered artillery engine, but they took the basic design, stripped it of fragility, and turned it into one of the most rugged and violent siege weapons in ancient history. That machine was the onager, named after a wild ass known for its explosive kicks, and the weapon earned its name. With a single vertical arm, twisted skeins of sinew, and a sling at its tip, the onager could launch massive stones or incendiaries hundreds of meters, with enough force to shatter walls or crush entire groups of defenders. Unlike its more sophisticated cousins, the ballistae, which looked and acted like giant crossbows, the onager was purely kinetic. It worked by twisting a horizontal bundle of tightly wound sinew or hair held in a frame, with a vertical throwing arm inserted into the middle. The arm was pulled back by a winch or manpower, compressing the skeins, and when released, the arm snapped forward violently, slamming into a crossbeam and hurling its payload skyward. The projectile could be a stone that weighed between 60 to 100 pounds, or in some cases a terracotta jar filled with Greek fire, pitch, or quicklime. Its maximum range was about 400 meters, though accuracy decreased dramatically at those distances. At medium range, between 150 to 250 meters, it was devastatingly effective, often used to destroy parapets, kill defenders behind walls, or collapse wooden watchtowers. The machine required a crew of 6 to 12 men, loaders, cranksmen, a fire master for the incendiary rounds, and a commander to handle targeting. Its bulk made it difficult to move, so onagers were typically assembled on site, using prefabricated parts carried in wagons. Once deployed, they could fire a few times per hour, depending on the weather and crew discipline. It was often deployed in siege teams where multiple machines would form artillery batteries, which would pound on a wall in coordinated strikes. In combination with battering rams, scaling towers, and tortoise formations, they softened enemy positions and cleared walls before the final charge. Their influence extended well into the medieval era. Byzantine engineers continued to use modified onagers into the 10th century, and early Islamic forces adopted similar torsion engines based on Roman designs. It was eventually superseded by the traction and counterweight trebuchets in the late Middle Ages, but for centuries, the onager was the ultimate short to mid-range siege shock weapon, noisy, unpredictable, and utterly Roman. This thing wasn't beautiful, it wasn't subtle either, but when it snapped and bucked, it sent a message loud enough to echo off stone walls across the empire. Rome is coming through. Number 8. The Chinese trebuchet, the earliest super weapon. Long before the counterweight trebuchets of medieval Europe dominated siege warfare, the Chinese had already mastered the concept with a simpler, lighter, and faster-firing variant known as the traction trebuchet, or in its most fearsome incarnation, the Hudun Pao, Crouching Tiger siege engine. Developed and used extensively during the Warring States period that was around 470 to 220 BCE, and perfected under the Tang and Song dynasties, these machines were visually stunning and mechanically lethal, capable of hurling 100-pound projectiles hundreds of feet with precision. Unlike the later European counterweight trebuchets, the Chinese traction trebuchet used human power instead of weights. The weapon consisted of a long throwing arm mounted on a pivot with a sling attached to one end and a rope bundle on the other. When the ropes were yanked down in unison by a team of soldiers, sometimes a dozen or more, the arm would swing upwards, launching the projectile in a high arc towards walls, towers, or enemy troops. This design allowed for a much faster rate of fire. Instead of resetting heavy counterweights, crews could reload and fire in rapid succession. And with multiple engines firing in a staggered sequence, Chinese armies could create continuous artillery barrages. In fact, during the Jinsong Wars, historical records mention Hudun Pao launching multiple fire bombs in under a minute, effectively setting large parts of siege camps ablaze. Its ability to be used from within fortified walls gave defenders a major edge. Its relative simplicity meant that even militia forces could operate them with minimal training. Visually, too, it was mesmerizing. Rows of soldiers yanking the ropes in unison gave the machine a kind of rhythm, almost like a ritual. Its bamboo and wood construction, often painted with a tiger motif, earned its nickname the Crouching Tiger, a reference to both the shape of the engine and its sudden, explosive action. While Western military history often overlooks the traction trebuchet in favor of the bigger, showier European versions, the Hudon-Pao deserves recognition not just as an early trebuchet, but as one of the first precision siege artillery platforms in world history. It didn't just break walls, it changed time, allowing China to leap centuries ahead in artillery strategy, while Europe was still hammering gates with logs. Moving on to number 7, the Claw of Archimedes. In the 3rd century BCE, as the mighty Roman Republic attempted to subdue the defiant city of Syracuse during the Second Punic War, they encountered a defense system so unusual and mechanically advanced that it seemed to defy the age it came from. That weapon was the legendary Claw of Archimedes, a mechanical grappling device mounted on the walls of Syracuse that could reach down into the sea, grab an attacking Roman warship, and lift it out of the water, capsizing or smashing it onto the rocks below. To witnesses, it seemed as though giant hands were rising from the city itself to pluck the ships out of the sea. Though no physical remains survive, the claw is one of the best attested to and most spectacular examples of ancient defensive siege engineering. Designed by Archimedes, the famous Greek mathematician, this claw was part of a larger suite of defensive war machines created to defend Syracuse from Roman attack during the siege of 213 to 212 BCE. When an enemy galley came within reach of the walls, the device would drop the hook onto the ship's rigging or deck, then haul it upwards with immense force. Some ships were flipped and capsized outright, and others were dropped from a height and their hulls shattered by the impact. This was not just a defense, it was theatrical warfare. The claw was likely powered by a system of winches, levers, and counterweights, all calculated with incredible precision, for which Archimedes was famous. Using principles of torque, balance, and momentum, his crews could exert massive lifting power from behind the safety of the city's defenses. And importantly, the claw wasn't used in isolation. Syracuse was protected by an array of devices engineered by Archimedes: catapults that could adjust trajectory, stone throwers that struck with lethal precision, and even early mirrors or burning devices, though those are more speculative. In the end, Syracuse fell, not by breaching the harbor, but through betrayal and infiltration. Roman troops entered the city by land, and while most of the defensive engineers were positioned to repel attacks from the sea, Archimedes himself was reportedly killed by a Roman soldier. For centuries after, engineers and generals spoke of Archimedes not just as a mathematician, but as a man who could build monsters from stone and rope. Devices that could reach out from the city walls, twist ships like toys, and turn the tide of war with invisible hands. The Claw of Archimedes was not just a weapon, it was a statement that brains could beat brawn, and that a single genius with a lever long enough could stop an empire. Number 6. The Assyrian Battering Ram. Long before Rome standardized siege doctrine, and before Carthage clashed with the legions, the Assyrian Empire, the first true superpower of the Iron Age, had already perfected one of the most visually and physically brutal siege weapons, the battering ram. And they didn't settle for logs on wheels. They built armored, mobile, bronze-plated siege beasts, complete with protective roofs, fire-resistant hides, and integrated projectiles. These were rolling warheads powered by the shoulders and grit of soldiers trained to punch holes in the defenses of cities across Mesopotamia. Now, the battering ram was a basic concept. A heavy beam, usually tipped with metal, swung horizontally to break gates or walls. But the Assyrians turned it into an art form. According to archaeological records, these machines were massive enclosed wagons mounted on wheels, with the ramming beam projecting forward through a hole in a protective shell. The outside of the ram was clad in thick hide, kept soaked with water to prevent fire. The roof was curved, built of layered timber, and often reinforced with bronze. The most terrifying variation included hooked ram heads designed to not just break walls but to tear stones loose. The Assyrians used these machines in dozens of successful sieges. From Babylon to Tyre and Lachish, these famous reliefs show not the machines themselves but also bodies falling from walls, captives being impaled, and towers collapsing under relentless pounding. They were instruments of imperial propaganda. But what made the Assyrian battering ram so epic wasn't its novelty, it was its mastery. They took an idea that every ancient army used and turned it into a symbol of state power, building them bigger, heavier, and more terrifying than anything seen before. These weren't auxiliary weapons, they were the main event, and cities across the ancient Near East learned that when the Assyrian ram appeared outside your gate, surrender was your only hope. Today, museums around the world display fragments and images of these machines, and they remain emblems of one of the earliest and most aggressive empires in history. And even now, 2,700 years later, few siege weapons capture the same mix of violence, engineering, and raw fear as the bronze-snouted battering rams of Assyria. Number 5. The Counterweight Trebuchet. So, among all the siege weapons ever built, none combined raw power, elegance, and terrifying effectiveness quite like the counterweight trebuchet. Known simply as the trebuchet, this gravity-powered engine of destruction emerged in the 12th century and quickly became the crown jewel of medieval siegecraft. Unlike the earlier traction trebuchet, which used teams of soldiers pulling ropes to power its arms, the counterweight trebuchet relied on a massive hanging weight. When the weight dropped, it whipped the throwing arm upwards, releasing a sling at just the right moment to send the projectile flying in a high arc. The weapon was typically built on site during sieges using heavy timber frames that were secured into the ground. The counterweight was often housed in a wooden box that could be filled or emptied to adjust power. The arm, pivoting in the middle of the frame, had a short rear section for the counterweight and a long forward section ending in a sling. Now, trebuchets were not just theoretical superweapons, they were field-proven engines of devastation. During the Siege of Acre, both Crusaders and Saracens deployed large trebuchets to rain stones on each other's camps. At the Siege of Châteauguay in 1204, King Philip II of France used trebuchets to break down the walls that had been considered unbreachable. And during the Mongol siege of Xinjiang in 1267, the Yuan dynasty famously constructed enormous counterweight trebuchets with the help from captured Muslim engineers. Some of the largest trebuchets recorded had names like the War Wolf, constructed by Edward I of England during his campaign in Scotland in 1304. But the true power of the trebuchet wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Watching a massive boulder just rise into the sky with a slow, graceful arc and come crashing down on your position was just pure medieval horror. Trebuchets could fire dead animals to spread disease, pots of burning pitch, or dismembered body parts as warnings. Well, despite its dominance, the counterweight trebuchet eventually faded with the advent of gunpowder artillery in the 14th and 15th centuries. Cannons could be moved more easily, fired more rapidly, and did even more damage. But for a brief period in medieval history, the trebuchet stood as the undisputed champion of siege warfare. Elegant, monstrous, and utterly unstoppable, they remain the pinnacle of pre-gunpowder engineering and a monument to what pure gravity, expertly harnessed, can accomplish in war. Number 4. The ballista. Long before the advent of cannons or gunpowder, there was one siege engine that terrified defenders: the ballista. Invented by the Greeks and perfected by the Romans, the ballista was a giant torsion-powered crossbow, capable of hurling bolts the size of javelins with such velocity they could skewer armored men, shattered shield walls, or even penetrate stonework. In the hands of skilled operators, it became a sniper rifle of the ancient battlefield, surgical, precise, and devastating. Now, the basic design of a ballista was pretty simple in concept, but complex in execution. Two horizontal arms were inserted into the skeins of twisted sinew or hair, a powerful, flexible medium that stored potential energy. The arms were pulled back by a central winch connected to a carriage with wheels or a fixed frame. A groove between the arms held the projectile, typically a massive iron-tipped bolt, carved from wood and stabilized with fletching. Upon release, the arms would snap forward, transferring energy into the projectile and launching it with incredible force. But what made ballistas so terrifying wasn't that force, it was the accuracy. Ancient records speak of them being used to target individuals on ramparts, especially officers or signal bearers. At the Siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE, Roman ballista crews reportedly picked off defenders standing at a specific location on the wall. At shorter ranges, within 100 meters, a ballista could reliably nail a man to a wall. Ballista bolts were designed for maximum penetration, and many were fitted with barbed heads, which would cause terrible injuries and could not be removed without massive trauma. Ballista crews were highly trained, calculating distance, adjusting torsion tension, and compensating for wind. Crews often worked in teams of 5 or more, with one man focusing solely on range finding and adjustment. Though later eclipsed by gunpowder weapons, the ballista's principles survived. Its use of torsion energy, arm-mounted propulsion, and guided projectiles laid the groundwork for modern mechanics. Even modern crossbows and launch systems trace their heritage back to it. Today, full-scale reconstructions of ballista have proven the accuracy and the power described by the ancient sources. They were no exaggeration, they were real, and they worked. Built not to terrify with noise or smoke, but with precision of a giant archer who never missed. Number 3. The siege crossbows of ancient China. Before the medieval world discovered siege crossbows, or even before the European ballista, ancient China had already perfected and deployed some of the most sophisticated, spectacular mechanical siege crossbows in history. Known in Chinese as Shenbinu, or divine arm crossbows, and their larger fixed counterparts known as zhuge crossbows, or multiple bolt machines. These weapons formed the backbone of Chinese siege doctrine. These siege crossbows weren't simply oversized handheld weapons, they were monumental machines, tower-mounted, crank-drawn, repeated firing mechanical beasts. They delivered lethal force with automation and speed that just stunned their enemies, and they looked like something out of a warlord's fevered dream. Let's start with the zhuge multiple bolt crossbow, a semi-automated repeating mechanism that featured a hopper-style magazine. Bolts would be stacked into a channel that fed them into the shooting groove. A single crank or lever pulled back the bowstring and released it in one motion, meaning that one operator could fire 10 bolts in just a few seconds. When mounted to defensive walls or siege towers, these weapons created a horizontal wall of death, sweeping enemy infantry or repelling climbers. But what made them even more astonishing is their use in siege defense and offense alike. In defense, they were placed on those wall-mounted gimbal arms, and during attacks they were loaded into siege towers or pushed forward on wheel carts. The psychological effect of the siege crossbow cannot be overstated. Imagine being a soldier attempting to scale a wall and hearing that mechanical arm thrum of a siege crossbow unleashing a bolt that just whistled through the air and embedded itself in your comrade's chest. Or picture a group of engineers digging saps under cover only to be picked off one by a machine that could hit you before you even came into view. These weren't random catapults or guess-fired stones, they were surgical artillery. The siege crossbows of ancient China remain one of the great marvels of ancient military engineering. They were elegant and terrifying. They were like death beams, but calculated machine-like precision weapons. They didn't roar, they didn't burn, but they pierced the silence of the battlefield and the flesh of those who underestimated them. Number 2. The Roman Scorpion. Among the many tools of destruction fielded by the Roman Empire, few combined mechanical elegance, battlefield versatility, and psychological terror quite like the Scorpion. This was not a siege tower, nor ram, nor even a weapon of mass destruction like the mighty onager or trebuchet. The Scorpion was something else, a precision instrument, a sniper weapon, a mechanical archer capable of picking off enemy combatants. The Scorpion was a torsion-powered bolt thrower, a compact artillery piece mounted on a two-legged wooden base with an armature that pulled back a single central bolt using tightly wound skins of twisted sinew or hair. At rest, the Scorpion's arms stood forward. When a crank or windlass was used to pull them back, the torsion bundles twisted like a spring under pressure. Once the arms were fully drawn, a heavy iron-tipped bolt was laid into the channel along the center line. The trigger, often a rotating pin or lever mechanism, was released, and the arms would snap forward, hurling the bolt in a straight trajectory towards its target. A Scorpion could launch 2 to 3 foot long bolts at speeds fast enough to penetrate enemy shields, armors, and bone, and it could do so with near pinpoint accuracy. But the Scorpion wasn't just a practical battlefield asset, it was a psychological weapon too. To an enemy soldier crouching behind a shield, the sound of a Scorpion bolt snapping overhead, or worse, slamming into the man next to you with bone-cracking force was horrifying. The bolts often passed completely through their targets, impaling multiple men or embedding themselves into walls behind. But what made the Scorpion truly epic wasn't just the design of it, it was its adaptability. It could be scaled up. Light models could be operated by a 2-man crew, medium models by 4, and heavy Scorpions mounted to carts or inside towers required 10-man teams that could launch bolts the length of a spear. It really wasn't just one weapon, it was its own class of weapons. In naval battles, smaller Scorpions were mounted on triremes, allowing ships to snipe enemy helmsmen or rake towers. On land, they could be used for ambushes, set into hillsides, or behind ridges. During urban combat, they were rolled into courtyards to fire down alleys or into towers. Even today, historians and engineers marvel at the elegance of it. Reconstructions using ancient materials have reproduced its lethal force, confirming that the weapon could fire 2-foot-long bolts over 300 meters and strike targets the size of a man at over 100 meters with deadly reliability. And perhaps that's the greatest tribute to this weapon. It didn't rely on mass flames or spectacular explosions. It relied on something much simpler, quieter, and more terrifying. A bolt traveling silently through the air, engineered to kill with scientific precision, functional, durable, scalable, and lethal in its perfection. Number 1. Alexander the Great's ocean-spanning causeway of conquest, the siege ram of Tyre. In 332 BCE, Alexander the Great arrived at the island city of Tyre, the last great naval stronghold of the Persian Empire in the eastern Mediterranean. Built half a mile offshore, Tyre was considered invulnerable to siege. Its towering fortifications rose directly from the sea, its harbors teemed with warships. Its defenders had centuries of experience resisting invaders from sea and land. Every previous army that had tried to conquer it had either failed or been forced to abandon the effort. To attack Tyre was to declare war on the ocean itself. So Alexander did something that no one, not the Persians, not the Greeks, not the Egyptians, had ever dared. He built a land bridge straight through the sea. And on top of it, he built one of the largest siege weapons in the ancient world, a mobile, ocean-bound siege tower and battering ram, a timbered monster of war so massive that it had to be floated on ships, lashed together and pushed towards the island, stone by stone. It wasn't just a siege, it was an act of engineering vengeance on a geological scale. The city of Tyre was a jewel of the Phoenician world, famous for its purple dye, its merchant fleets, and its powerful double harbors. Its walls rose over 45 meters in places, and its position offshore made it impossible to approach without a fleet. Alexander had no fleet, at least not yet. After securing the mainland city of Old Tyre, which had already been connected to the island by trade routes and land defenses, Alexander sent envoys to negotiate the city's surrender. The Tyrians responded by murdering the messenger and throwing their bodies into the sea. That act sealed their fate. Rather than retreat, Alexander gave an order that stunned even his own engineers. Build a causeway. A massive mole of stone and timber rise above the sea, extending from the shoreline all the way to the gates of Tyre. Construction began immediately. The initial phase involved drilling wooden pilings into the seabed, laying down layers of rubble and carting thousands of tons of rock from surrounding quarries. Every inch of progress brought them closer and closer to resistance. The Tyrians launched fire ships, rained down stones from catapults, and sent divers to destroy the submerged foundation. Alexander responded by building siege towers directly on the causeway, protected by hides soaked in vinegar, outfitted with torsion-powered artillery, and mounted with battering rams that could be rolled forward under cover. One tower, the largest, was 9 stories tall, clad in iron plating and pushed by hundreds of men. It carried archers, stone throwers, fire crews, and at its core, a huge iron-tipped battering ram. The Tyrians, realizing that the threat was real, launched a brilliant counterattack. They filled a ship with pitch, sulfur, and dried wood, lit it on fire, and sailed it directly into the mole, setting the siege towers ablaze. Alexander's crew fought the flames, but the damage was done. The causeway partially collapsed. Months of progress were lost. And so he started again. This time Alexander widened the causeway, strengthened its outer defenses, and ordered the construction of an even larger tower and ram. Then came the naval turning point. Alexander's allies, the Phoenician cities of Byblos, Arwad, and Sidon, switched sides and delivered him a fleet of over 200 warships. Now, with a full naval blockade, Alexander launched attacks from both the sea and land, hammering the walls with catapults, stone throwers, and the floating siege ram. Finally, a section of the wall collapsed, and Alexander launched his assault. Troops surged across the mole, swarmed up scaling ladders, and leapt from floating towers and breached the city. The aftermath was brutal. Over 6,000 Tyrians were killed in the battle. Another 30,000 were enslaved. Only a handful of citizens who had taken refuge in the city's temples were spared. But the floating siege ram was more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of what Alexander represented. He didn't just conquer nations, he was remaking the world down to its shorelines. In the centuries since, no siege weapon has so dramatically altered both a battle and a map. The floating ram of Tyre was the physical manifestation of conquest, driven not by rage, but by cold, mechanical determination. At its heart was a ram, simple in concept, unstoppable in purpose, powered not by oxen or rope, but by the will of a king who believed no walls were beyond reach.